Barbara, let's start with you. You're one of the very first curators of video. I'm curious to hear how you got started.
It all began in the early 70s. MoMA hired me, and I was very young. I was very bright-eyed and very energetic. There I was in New York. There I was at MoMA, and I just went to everything I could. I was going to hear music at the Mud Club at Max's Kansas City. I was going to screenings. I was going to Anthology Film Archives, and I chatted with artists. And being very curious, then I just tried to talk with everyone I could possibly. And I always had what I called an open door. If somebody was coming through from abroad or from another city, I would always see them because information was scarce. I also organized, I would call it a show and tell lecture series where artists came and showed their work and talked about it. And we recorded every presentation. That became a transcript. That became material that I could use. So I put together an ephemera collection because so little was written. So that's now in the MoMA library and the archives. These two artists I'm in dialogue with tonight were very important to expanding my knowledge. So I'm grateful.
So Martha and Tony, could you tell us what compelled you to take up video?
First, let me underline the fact that Barbara was a true pioneer and that she really did establish the collection and ran it for decade upon decade at the premier museum of modernism. Now that has some negative effects on what she could do in terms of, what is, if video is art or not. But I just want to say we owe Barbara a tremendous debt. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I had many friends who were mostly poets, but also avant-gardists. And then we all wound up in California. There was a big New York cohort. And at some point, Ellie Anton started making videos. And she suggested to a bunch of the graduate students, which at that point I was one, why don't you learn video? Charlie Cox in the medical school has a real studio. So why don't you go down to the basement and learn video? So we did. And the point was the quality of the image was so bad that no one was going to judge you on that. And so you were free to make the crappiest thing you wanted as you wanted. And also it was extremely easy to reproduce and distribute. All of that was really important to me. It's not that I wanted crappy images. It's just that I was allergic to high production values. And I also saw the advantage of using a format and a form that could speak directly to television, which was destroying our lives as artists along with the rest of mass culture.
And just to get a taste of what Martha does, here we are.
Which made the original allegation. The White House official today was asked about comment. Robin Lloyd is following. Administration officials now say claim that the Soviet ship, minesweepers, and surface aircraft, all when port of Corinto, to try to determine the number of. This was the second major Soviet army. Administration officials have confirmed Soviet bloc freighters headed for Nicaragua.
The Sandinista dictatorship of Nicaragua, with full Cuban Soviet bloc support, not only persecutes its people, the church, and denies a free press, but arms and provides bases for communist terrorists attacking neighboring states. Support for freedom fighters is self-defense and totally consistent with the OAS and UN charters.
The tape goes through multiple things, and it's an erased tape. It was chosen for the obvious fact that it interferes and interrupts with the broadcast news television symbol. It opens with the sound of the nightly NBC nightly news and the Universal. That's me.
And it's called, If It's Too Bad to Be True, It Could Be Disinformation.
Which is a headline from the New York Times.
I think I came to video initially because it allowed me to do work on the multiple things that I was thinking of and wanted to work on. Sound, image, and text. My involvement with video kind of started, as many, I think, people did, maybe the 70s and 80s, through performance. I dropped out of a photo program to sculpture, and it seemed like it would be a logical thing to do, time-based work in that kind of format, trying to locate things in a kind of social and discursive context.
Both are amazing in how you edit and put the images together and the text together. And then just to think how the curators of signals, what do you do with this large amount of information and how are you going to organize it? Tony is in the only black box in quote gallery in the show. Martha's work is in a kind of single channel area. So these are two essential formats that video emerged as. It's not like it's only single channel and it's only installation. There's such diversity, but how to program that, how to make it understandable, how to give it a textured experience for the viewer.
One of the things that interests me about video is that movement back and forth between single channel presentation and installation presentation. I think early in my work, I was involved in installation as a way of later pulling out single channel elements for other use. And I never really saw it as a kind of absolute binary. But strangely enough, now I'm doing the opposite. I'm combining what had maybe been first presented as single channel work into constellations of works at different scales using different technologies. I think that too has always been a kind of interesting thing to me. The scale, the location, technology can vary so much from project to project. And sometimes the same work can have much different impacts and placement and relations.
The technology is not really what it's all about, quite the opposite. What it's about is what it's about.
I kind of see the technology more as delivery systems or contextualizations. Those can change over time. It's not totally dependent on a single sort of presentation modality, at least not for me.
I've been troubled about the transformations of video as they've been museumized, and I would say that it's hard to get away from the obvious fact that the Signals exhibition insists on sticking apparatus-heavy structures in your face. I'm a bit concerned about the need to create fantastic, slick boxes in order to make people want to look at our work. We're all supposed to die for an experience. Everything is supposed to be an experience, which is a little bit narcissistic, but it's also very trendy. What I mean is it's actually a major force in how we are supposed to be experiencing everything by a self-subjectivization.
Could you talk a little bit about how the accelerated technological fast changes affect your work? Do you feel pressured to adapt to these, to incorporate these?
For me, it's like more about the content that I want to deliver and not so much about keeping up with changing forms, which change with such regularity that I personally can't invest the time and energy in trying to keep up with the technical changes. I'm much more interested in just basic methodological and content problems.
I've been pondering the title of the exhibition. It says Signals How Video Transformed the World, but actually this is a show of video art, and it is absolutely centered on video as art, video within the museum or a museum adjacent, and always calling on the history of the avant-garde and the saintly John Cage and a few other people who are constantly being put at the head of the idea that they invented video art, when that is probably not true. As far as I'm concerned, the art world in its relationship to media, both photography and video, is regressing to a kind of masterwork moment. The aesthetic elements are foregrounded, and what that often means is that the largely white men of the 60s who were last featured are now having museum shows again.
Barbara, your book is titled Video/Art, right? So how do you, when you were starting out with trying to put video in a museum context, how did you deal with all of these issues?
I didn't want to call it video art, but they really insisted, because we all know sales happen when people do a search. It was a fight. At least I got the slash.
It's interesting that it seems that there is also more desire from curators, not in the US often, to show work. I've thought a lot about that, but I can't quite explain it. Things that even are very sort of American and that represent a non-traditional take on those cultures, contexts, and forms may get readings in other places before they can actually become legible here.
What we call conceptual art has any presence in the United States because it had a presence in Europe. Anything that asks the audience to think and consider is definitely taboo to most curators in the US and is the lifeblood of the discourses about art in Europe. That applies to every conceptual artist, which I can be considered, I guess. We had shows in Europe long before we were even considered within American institutions, which still suffer from Cold War fright and a certain trend toward populism that asks people not to think.
The MoMA audience is very smart. They walk in the door and they are curious, and they stop at very hard to fathom art, and they actually look at it. So I just think it's just totally crazy.
Because it's institutionally driven, not audience driven. One thing is we need to be cognizant of the fact that museums have relatively unbreakable ideas of what should be within its walls, and that these strictures are determined by people who are trained to see things through an aesthetic lens to begin with, to recognize craft and artisanal quality and production values, and whose donors do as well. And also they tend to be a bit lax about the way to reach out to communities. I still say that there are strictures about the idea that this work is now accepted as an art object and to be discussed within the ideas of the reigning society, which tends to minimize struggle, questioning, and open-endedness. I just think that what it's necessary is not to allow that to be an apparently transparent window, but rather to see it as a structure which heavily controls and defines discourse and value. What I'm trying to say is I don't know the answer, but I do see the consciousness of the need to actually step beyond and to constantly tweak the museum or pinch it and say, yes, but you're just making it into another art object. That's not enough. It's not, you can't use it as a merit badge. There needs to be some actual connection to a community.
Yeah, maybe it involves a recognition that the social possibilities and functions for art are not only aesthetic, that they actually can have true social implications if they are not aesthetically pleasing or breakthroughs.
Down with avant-gardism, long live the avant-garde.